Now I'm going to give you a big crash course on the rest of the history. After Muhammad's death, Muslim Arabs fell back into their tribal war and civil wars. And they began to fight over who would become the next leader. So they broke up, and I always love it when they the same people who are like, oh, Christians are so horrible and bad, they're always fighting all the time, they've got all these denominations, and they turn over and they're like, look at the Muslims. They're all united people. The Muslims have over 150 sects within 50 years after Muhammad died. Okay, so they immediately started warring with each other, they started fighting with each other, and they broke into 150 different branches that all started interpreting Muhammad's writings differently within 50 years. Now that's not an anti-Islamic thing, because the Christians did the same thing. That's why we have 1st, 2nd Corinthians, because we were breaking up and falling apart too. That's just called human nature, and that's why we need Jesus. So they began to divide up, and at the same time they began to move outside the Arab world, first seizing control of Israel in 638. So when he dies in 632, they immediately went to Israel, they conquered Israel, they killed all the Jews that were there and the Christians, and they took over and controlled Israel. And they will control Israel until the British come along in 1948 and give it to the Jews, which we've already talked about. So that's when they gained it. By 700s AD, an Islamic state had moved into Central Asia, North Africa, Spain, and France. The expansion happened mostly by force, but sometimes by peaceful proselytizing, or what we know as evangelism. If you guys, and I forgot to bring a map, but everybody's familiar with the Mediterranean world. And on the eastern side of the Mediterranean world is what we know as Arabia and Israel. And if you go along the bottom side of the Mediterranean is Africa, North Africa. You go across the top, that's Turkey, Greece, Austria, Germany, going into there, and then into Europe. So and then Europe is on the left side, the western side. So basically the Muslims moved 3 different directions. They began to move their way up through Turkey and across the top, and they began to go towards Europe over the top of the Mediterranean. Simultaneously, they moved down to the south through Africa, coming up through Spain towards Europe. And at the same time, they began to move out into Asia, and then they eventually made their way to India. And so those are the 3 major directions, which are really the only 3 directions you can go. But the point is they moved all directions and began to conquer the world. By the 700s AD, less than 60 years after Muhammad's death, they had already pretty much controlled all of North Africa going to Spain. They had controlled all of Israel, all of what we know as modern-day Turkey, and were already beginning to push in on Greece within less than 60 years. And they were already taking lots of Asia and already going towards India. So this is the conquest. Why did they do this? Because this is the example that Muhammad set. So a lot of people will argue with you that Muhammad never ever conquered the world in the name of Islam. That was his followers. His followers did it though, because that was the example that he set. I don't know how you could get any other example from his life than that. They moved through. During this time, Islam had become a more clearly defined religion, an elaborate system of ritual, doctrine, law, and they became clearly different than those of non-Muslims. So this time period, their doctrine starts becoming solidified. It starts becoming more concrete. The line between a Muslim and a non-Muslim and beliefs and religions start becoming more clear. And by the 700s, there now are clearly identified, completely different religion in everybody's eyes as they begin to do their conquests. How did they determine leaders? This is where we become the break. Now today, the 2 most popular sects that we hear of is the Sunnis and the Shiites. And the media like you to believe that the Shiites are the violent ones, and they're mostly in Iran. And the peaceful ones are Sunnis, and Sunnis are everywhere. So see, most of them are peaceful. The problem with this is that is not at all why they're divided. Basically what happens, Muhammad died, they begin to argue who should become the leaders, the followers. A group of people said that we think Muhammad's biological descendants should be the leaders. And there was a guy by the name of Ali, who was his nephew, who was the oldest biological descendant, and they began to push him. Now another group said, no. This is clearly a military religion. And the people who have been leading and standing next to Muhammad's side, the ones who have been the most loyal by his side, doing more Islamic work than anybody else, are his generals, which they would call caliphs. And so they would say the caliphs, because those are who Muhammad picked, that's who Muhammad trusted. Those are the ones who stood next to his side. The family was there, but the family wasn't right up in the front with Muhammad like his generals were. And so this became the divide. The Shiites should be biological descendants. The Sunnis said it should be the caliphs, the generals. And that's the only difference between a Shiite and a Sunni. It's political, not religious. And that's why you go to Iran, and most of what you'll find in Iran today is most Muslims in Iran are Muslims by force. The Iranian government is a very dictatorial, very power-hungry, very Islamic, violent religion. And they control things. Most of the people in Iran, they still identify themselves as Assyrians from the Assyrian Empire. And they find their identity in that, and specifically Zoroastrianism, which is their religion. And they pretty much are only Muslims when the government comes to their house. And they hate the government. If you've ever seen the movie Argon, it kind of shows you a little bit of that. I mean, in the 70s, there was a huge uprising of the people against the government. Unfortunately, the uprising didn't last very long. So, yes, you can point to Iran and say, look, that's one of the most violent countries right now in the media. And it's like, yeah, but that's the government. If you talk to everyday normal people, which I have, because I actually have a friend who came from Iran and converted to Christianity here, they have a different story. And then I had 2 students who are Iranian. And they were in my classes, and their dad tells a different story of what life is like over there and what the media paints. But then you go over to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is some of the most violent people, and they're Wahhabi and Sunnis. And so violence and peacefulness has nothing to do with the sect you're a part of. It just really has more to do with what country you were raised in, kind of a thing. Listen, and it's even more complicated than that. The media just likes to oversimplify things. By now, we all know. Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians were not always forced to convert, but they did suffer from restrictions. They were oppressed, forced to pay special taxes, forbidden to wear certain colors, and prohibited from marrying Muslim women. Not every country that they go into did they mass exterminate everybody. Some countries they did allow. Probably a lot of it had to do with politics. They were like, wow, we're going to kill a lot. I mean, this religion is so powerful and so strong here. This is going to be good bloodshed. It's just easier to let them practice their own religion. Then they would come in, they become the political power. But what they did do is they would persecute them. They would lose all the good jobs, and they were pushed down into the lower paying jobs. They were taxed higher than everybody else, and any color that was associated with the religion was forbidden to be worn, and they weren't allowed to really be friends or intermarry with Muslim people. So even though you're not technically dying, it's very clear that you're being persecuted. And this is Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, everybody. So they didn't always kill everybody, but they did shackle you down big time. The only countries that are really being able to stop the Muslim invasion right now is Austria is putting up a great defense, keeping them from going to Europe, and France. I know that's shocking, but France is putting up a great defense at that time. So Spain's pretty much been overrun by the Muslims. Greece has been overrun. That's why if you go to Spain and Greece, you can still see a lot of Muslim architecture. But if you go deeper into like France and that kind of stuff, you won't see a lot of it. Although that's changing as that culture is changing. So in 732 AD, Charles Martel, the ruler of the Franks, which we know as France, stopped the Muslims from invading Europe. So he stopped that massive Muslim invasion, and they backed off for a while. Now in Asia, the Abbasid dynasty rose to power. This is called the Golden Age of Islam, and during this time the Muslims continued many attempts to conquest of Europe. So he successfully put them down and stopped that initial inertia, but they just kept trying to come back over and over again. Also during this time period, the Muslims invaded India, and they began a brutal genocide of the Indian people. Most historians, including Muslim historians, claim that between the years of 1000 AD and 1500 AD, the population of India decreased from 200 to 170 million people. Most people put the figures of this genocide at 20 million people. It is considered the largest genocide ever in human history. And it is not Hitler against the Jews. It was the Islamic nations against the Indian people. And the Indian people, for whatever reason, put up a bigger resistance. I mean, even Alexander the Great didn't do a very good job invading India. India was like a force to be reckoned with. And they actually, when they took over, they actually would just grab Indian people and bring them and just massacre them on a daily basis, trying to reduce their numbers. It was not like just dying in war. We're talking about just grabbing women and children on a daily basis, bringing before and just slaughtering them as a mass genocide. This doesn't get talked about in the media because it's politically incorrect to talk about this. But it is today considered the largest case of genocide in world history, is the Muslims against the Indian people. And when India talks about Muslim, there's no political correctness. They are deeply scarred by this, because this, remember, this will go from 1000 to 1500 AD, specifically targeted, and it will not really completely end until the 1700s. So this is very fresh in their memory. Responding to the threat, in 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade from the Western Europe, which captured much of Syria, the Crusades, and lasted from 1095 to 1289. Now, we all know about the Crusades, but none of us know about the Crusades. If you really want a great book on the Crusades, get a book called God's Battalion by Rodney Stark. God's Battalion by Rodney Stark. If you want to look at it, right down, because you can't, it's right here, okay? You can look at it later. God's Battalion by Rodney Stark is a great book. Rodney Stark was a semi-atheist who didn't really like Christianity. He wasn't an antagonist of Christianity. He was an incredible scholar, and he began to study a lot of the Christian time periods of the medieval period, and he began to realize, wow, Christianity actually has something for it. And he converted to Christianity, studying Christianity from the medieval period. And he's a historian. There's two kinds of historians. There's 90% of the historians who just read other historians and then tell you about history. There's another 10% who actually read original documents written by the people from that time period and tell you about it. And he's one of those. And he goes back to the original documents of the people, the Muslims and the Christians, and he tells you the history of the Crusades. It's really good. And it gives you a really good, accurate picture. And he's not anti-Muslimness. He praises the Muslims when they need to be praised, and he gives them credit when they need to be credited. And he even says in this case they weren't even as violent as what people made them out to be, but they weren't as peaceful. And so it's actually a really good book. And I think a lot of it, there's a lot of credibility lended to somebody who used to be an atheist and becomes a Christian and writes this kind of stuff. So we're not going to go through the Crusades, but just know the Crusades are not at all what you've been told. Cornell University in the 1700s actually began to make an agenda of destroying Christianity in the medieval period. And if you go back and read their original writings of the professors of that university, they will tell you that we are making up history, even if that's what it takes to make Christians look bad in the medieval period. And that's what's mostly taught in textbooks. So in their own words from the 1700s, they told you they weren't interested in history, they were only interested in destroying Christianity. And that's largely what's taught in schools today, is their version of Christianity. There's another book, because I know medieval period is often called the Dark Ages, because that's from the Christians. If you want a book that will blow that myth out of the water, there's a book called The Water Wheel, The Plow, and something. I can go look it up. I got it on my bookshelf at home. These scholars are respected by all scholars. And they've got a really good book in saying, like, the medieval period actually advanced technology and culture more than any other time period in history. It was the Enlightenment that everything actually began to slow down. And so they got tons of evidence. So those are two books that will get you into that history if you're interested in that. In the 1200s, why did the Crusades come in? Why did the Muslims come to an end? Because the Mongols. The Mongols were an unstoppable force, and they basically went throughout the entire culture, and they just began to wipe everybody out. Not because of religion, just because they wanted power. But eventually, what happened is the Black Death came. And the only thing that stopped the Mongols was the Black Death. If there was no Black Death, we might all be Mongols today. Like literally, they were that force. So that kind of stopped them. But somewhere in there, the Mongols that survived actually started converting to Islam. And they then started promoting Islam. So when they recovered, they started conquesting again. But then now they were all Muslims. And this then leads to the Ottoman Empire. And then Turkey starts really embracing Islam. And this is where it becomes a political force. At this time period, it's just people. But it's the Ottoman Empire that turns it into a big, giant political machine. And they're the ones that begin to go in to Europe. And this is where it becomes interesting, because at this point in history, it's no longer just Islam against Christianity. It's Ottoman Empire trying to destroy and take over the Habsburg Empire and the Austrian Empire. And the Austrian and the Habsburgs are trying to take over them. And so by the way, some of them happen to be Christians and some happen to be Muslims. And that's when it all gets really messy and really complicated. And it's really easy for a historian just to point to one thing and say, see, and it's just way too complicated. The minute religion and politics mix together, you can't make any valid point anymore. In my opinion. The minute religion and politics mix together, you can't make any valid points anymore about what is right and wrong, or what is really truly Christian, what is truly Islam. And so Turkey was known for persecution, but they were also known for letting people live in peace. And it was just it was mostly about world conquest and that kind of stuff. And so the Ottoman Empire is then the one that took the moon and the star, and they're the ones that began to make it the official symbol of Islam. That's where it started going on, all the flags, the uniforms, all that kind of stuff. And the Ottoman Empire is located in Turkey. And so they began to push in. On September 11th, 1683, the Ottoman Empire was pushing in on Austria and the Habsburg Empire. And the last point of defense was Austria, Vienna. Vienna was no holds barred. And on September 11th, 1683, Vienna knew that if everybody in Europe knew that if Vienna fell, all of Europe would become the Ottoman Empire. Europe had been throwing so many people at Vienna to stop the Ottoman Empire in the Muslim invasion that there was no one left to give to Vienna anymore. So if Vienna fell, all of Europe was going to fall, especially when the Muslims were already in Spain, large as well. And so on September 11, 1683, if you read the writings of the people in Vienna, they in their writings saying, this is it. We will not be here tomorrow. And all of Europe will be the Ottoman Empire, and all of Christianity will be lost and completely destroyed. That night, September 12th, the next day, the Polish, Austrian, and German armies, in one last-ditch attempt, pulled a bunch of armies together, and the Polish and the Austrians and the Germans came together, and they moved into Vienna, and they stopped the Muslim invasion. At that point, between the Black Death still happening and other things happening and all this kind of stuff, that was such a defeat on the Ottoman Empire that the Ottoman Empire began to collapse. And once they began to collapse, then Europe, for the first time ever since 700 AD, was free from a Muslim invasion. There had never been a time that Muslims were not invading them since 700 AD. And this is what Europe considers their Independence Day. The way that we look at July 4th is the way they look at September 12th, 1683. And now that the Muslim Ottoman Empire threat is no longer a threat anymore, Europe is actually now able to start recovering. And what begins to happen? The Enlightenment. And then who ends up defeating the Austrians and the Habsburgs that so successfully protected them? Napoleon. And that's where we enter what we call what's modern European history. So the Ottoman Empire in 1683, 1683 is considered the beginning of modern European history. 1683. Muslims, the Ottoman Empire kind of fell apart, and guess what happened? Europe went to their lives, and they forgot about the Muslims. And they just started to develop. And there was no bitterness, no antagonism, nothing. Like, they just went on, and they were an old enemy that had been defeated. Long time ago, completely forgot. Just like people of today's generation, the new kids probably have nothing to know about Vietnam. That they don't have any. There's no scars, there's no memories, there's no political agendas there. Vietnam War is something in the history book. So they forgot about it. The Muslims forgot about it. They went back to their world, and they did their own thing, and they started developing separately. And at this time period, Islam kind of begins to develop. And at this time period, Islam starts becoming, some are peaceful and some are violent. And the diversity between Muslims of being peaceful and violent is the same as Christians and anybody else. So a lot of people begin to forget about it.